Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I should like to convene this meeting of the New York State DNA Subcommittee. My name is Jack Ballantyne, the chair of this committee, and I should like to welcome all committee members. We also have the Commissioner of DCGS, Denise O'Connell, here, and we have some distinguished guests sitting in the room beside us. Without further ado, I'd like to ask the committee to look at the meeting agenda that was sent to us by DCGS for their review and approval in terms of how we're going to proceed this morning. So does the committee, do all members have a draft agenda? And I would be...
It's fine, I move to accept the agenda.
I second it.
Any discussion? All those in favour of accepting and proceeding as given in the draft, say aye. Aye. Thank you. So let's proceed. The first item then is reviewing the draft minutes from our last meeting, January 23rd. And again, the subcommittee members should have a copy of that, of our minutes, draft minutes.
I'll motion that we accept the minutes
Okay.
as drafted.
Any second?
Second.
Any discussion? Further discussion on this? Okay. All those in favour of approving the minutes as given to us, say aye. Aye. Thank you. Moving along relatively quickly, the next item is old business, and this is an update on remediation from the external DNA QAS quality assurance audits, and Kathy Levine will update us on that. Kathy?
Yes, at the last meeting you were given the DNA QA audits from a number of labs, and there's two issues that were left outstanding with the New York City OCME, and they have received, I handed out just a brief, a few letters to you today, but they have received some feedback from their DNA audit. And for the New York City lab, they have overturned two of their. They were contesting five of the findings, and FBI has overturned two of those. So those were related to the mitochondrial DNA tech leader, and they agreed with the laboratory that those were not problems, and now they will be just finishing remediation on the other findings. Eugene Lean from the New York City OCME lab is here if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, a lot of these were related to a particular individual, the technical
Yes.
lead, and so basically, the FBI has accepted many of the responses that OCME had provided regarding his qualifications and experience. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Subcommittee members have any discussion on this? Any further discussion? So probably we should just say we've noted this and
Taken it under advisement.
taken it under advisement, and happy that the FBI has accepted the recommendations regarding this Europe technical leader.
The next laboratory was the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences, and also was distributed today was the letter dated January 30th from the endless custodian, and they had overturned the finding associated with, which was standard 9.5, which was related to the NIST, use of the NIST standards. And they must have accepted the remediation on the standard 13.1, which was the proficiency testing. So they're continuing on with that. And this is as far their audit now is finalized. This is just update for you from.
Yes.
We left a few things open from the last meeting.
So again, this shows you that when one undergoes an audit, then it's certainly worthwhile challenging audit findings if they don't, if the lab doesn't feel that they were appropriate. And in both cases, then that we've heard this morning, labs challenging audit findings were able to get them overturned. The rulings. Yes. Again, I think with any further discussion on this from the committee members. If not, again, we'll just note that I'd like to thank the labs for doing their best to conform to all appropriate accreditation guidelines. Okay, with that then, the next item, which should take up the remainder of the time, is this discussion on the request for guidance regarding criteria needed for release of information in cases of inadvertent matches, partial matches. This comes about obviously in an operational setting from the concept that you have a crime scene sample and you try and interrogate a database and you don't get a direct match to anyone in that database, but however there's a possibility that you can get what's called a partial match. And you can get that partial match because in your searching of that database you can change the search criteria to one, for example, here called moderate stringency, to such a degree that you may not get a direct match, but there may be some elements, some alleles that will in fact match to such a degree that a familial relationship may or may not be implicated. So my understanding is that the Commission has formally asked us, since we're an advisory body to the Commission, to look into the technical aspects of how one would proceed with, from the scientific standpoint, partial matches. How one first of all, how one would investigate a partial match, and how one would come up with statistical criteria that would help establish the meaningfulness of that partial match. So as a result of us being asked to do this by the Commission, we set up at the last meeting a small subcommittee of this subcommittee that basically comprised two of our world-leading experts here sitting around the table today, George Carmody and Ranajit Chakraborty, and they were tasked with speaking to operational labs within the state and basically tasked with coming up with an initial discussion document or initial set of criteria for a further discussion. So if I could ask George Carmody, who was the chair of that subcommittee, to brief us on what the outcome was.
Okay, thank you, Jack. And let me just say that we had this little surprise letter last night that I received that I think maybe I should address that just at the outset here. We did have a meeting. It was Ranajit, myself, Mekki, and Barry Dusman. There he is, right in front of me. Was over there. We did go through the draft, and I must say the draft is essentially the policy that was drafted by Barry, I guess in consultation with Mekki. I'm not sure what the exact origins were, but we had a conference call about it, and what you see in front of you in this document that's watermarked with draft on it is essentially the version that we had concurred on over the phone, and I'm happy with that. But let me just, as I started to say, address this letter, because the letter, I think, what did say, I wouldn't want to use the word misinformed, but is addressing a different situation. I get, and having read this letter, is addressing the situation where what a policy might be if you were proactively going to do familial searching. If, for example, you were to take all of the forensic profiles and run them against all of the database, the offender database, and calculate something for each of those comparisons, how would you, what should you compare, what should you be looking for, what statistical criteria should you invoke in order to ensure that you were getting high quality matches that way for familial searching? We're addressing another situation. So I think the letter from that perspective is making points that are not relevant to what we were trying to do here, that we're not advocating that if we were to do familial searching, that you should start by doing a moderate search. It is not going to be effective, and we are not recommending that. In the partial match situation, however, we're not aggressively going out and looking for deliberately close family members or potentially close family members, but we're saying suppose you get situations where you do get these moderate matches. How can we maybe sift through those for those that are likely to be of high quality and are more likely to lead to useful investigations and finding a family member and so forth. So the policy that we have here and that the committee agreed upon is not addressing the situation that this letter is talking about. So I just think that the letter from that perspective, while it's useful and goes into statistical criteria that I think certainly Ranajit and myself would agree about, I have no questions about that perspective. It's not the question we were asked about in this subcommittee, the subcommittee of the subcommittee.
And just for the record, that letter that we're referring to is a letter we received yesterday from an unsolicited letter from
Gilder and Dan Crane.
Yeah, Jason Gilder and Dan Crane, addressed to myself. So that, for the record, is the letter we're referring to here.
Right. And you had responded to that late last night, I believe, Jack. I got your email on that.
I responded by saying that I thanked Drs. Crane and Gilder for their input and interest in what we're doing here, but I suggested or indicated that it would be unlikely that we had all a chance to appropriately review that letter, and but no doubt in our discussions as we proceed with this, there's no doubt whatsoever this will be a useful background material for us in terms of what we're looking at. But as you said, they're looking at a different thing. You're suggesting, George, it's not relevant because it's a familial search policy, whereas here we're not talking about a familial search policy, we're talking about a partial match policy, which is there's a clear distinction there.
Yes, even though, I mean, a lot of the statistical aspects of it overlap, certainly. But that's not the question we were addressing in this committee. So we're addressing the situation where these do turn up, where you do get these shared loci, high likelihood ratios, and so forth, in essentially in the course of doing regular searches for finding potentially cold hits. And these turn up sort of inadvertently. So we're not addressing that familial search issue, which I think if the Commission itself wants us to give some recommendations on that in aspect of future potential use, if the Commission thinks that there are situations where you want to do aggressively, I would say aggressively, but proactively familial searching, there would be other considerations. And certainly I'm pretty sure, I mean, I haven't discussed this in detail with Ranajit, but Ranajit, I'm guessing that their perspective here we would agree upon in terms of, there's the balancing of the false positives with the false negatives, and you can work those things out. Essentially, in this partial match policy, we are addressing that, but we're really only addressing with these, acronym expected match ratios and expected kinship ratios. What we're trying to prevent is having a lot of false positives, we would call them. That is that these look like they could be related, but really, statistically, we can evaluate that it's unlikely they're coming from two people who are closely related. So we weren't addressing the other issue, which if you're going to do familial searching actively, you want to capture as many as possible. With the partial match policy, we're not worrying about those false negatives, you would call them, those that we don't pick up. You know, we're not going to worry about those with this partial match policy because we don't see them. They're that, you know, we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. And so looking at the tip of the iceberg, we want to make sure that we're up at the high end of the tip of that iceberg where we're likely to get useful leads and not a lot of false positives up there. So that's essentially what I would say in this. And you have the policy here. I can go through it. There's essentially saying in the case of at the ENDIS level, we're saying that, well, we're going to let the FBI use and apply their policy when they do get these partial matches and use this approach. We haven't seen exactly what the FBI is going to recommend yet, but Swigdam certainly recommended using this expected match ratio, which if I can just talk to those things briefly too, where there's another complication here that I need to address as sort of a little sidebar. And that is that it would have been nicer if we could have distributed this ad hoc recommendation that Swigdam passed 9 months ago, last July. And we have pursued getting permission to distribute to everybody, and it seems as though the powers that be prefer to wait until this is officially published in Forensic Science Communications. And so we can't distribute that to you, but I know Ranajit, myself, Jack Ballantyne has seen it, and I'm guessing that Barry has seen it as well, if not others here. So but we can't officially distribute that. But it gives the basis for coming up with these two numbers, the expected match ratio and the expected kinship ratio, which seem rather daunting in their wording. And when you look at the equations, it will seem to most people to be pretty daunting. But in fact, it's pretty straightforward, and Ranajit and I have vetted these, and we're in agreement with them, I would say. So if you want, we can go through these, the recommendation, or I don't know, I take your guidance as to what we should do next.
So the documents we have then, we have this partial match policy. Is that the document here? There's a partial match policy. Is that a document you're referring to, George?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
This is 2 pages.
And then there's another document that says release of convicted offender's name in the event of a partial match. Is that separate?
Yes. Well, my understanding is that would be for individual casework.
The policy statement is just that first page. I don't know what
Oh, okay. Well, it actually spills over to a second page, Barry, so that's the policy.
Please state your name for the record, just for the...
Sorry.
Please state your name for the record.
Barry Buchanan, in the actual policy, page where it spills over on the second page.
Yeah.
And the other, if there for informational purposes, to show you how we intend to implement it.
So it'd be just the form as it would be implemented?
Actually, this is a form that we would use to implement policy. The last page is a stepwise, almost chronological description of how we would use, or how we would respond, or how we expect the local laboratories to respond. The facing page on that second group of staple papers is a form that DCJS would use to make sure all the information is together that is needed to release the name. So this is basically for informational purposes. The first set of staples that papers
Is the policy
is the
itself.
policy.
Yeah. So I guess everybody has copies of those and know what we're referring to.
And so this is a draft document then that we can discuss. Then it's basically and George, you and Ranajit have been involved in
Yes, and
vetting this,
Mekki and Barry
Yes.
as well.
So is it worth our while then discussing this document in detail? Then that's my question.
Well, I think it might. I can go through and if we want to make comments on individual parts of it, but Essentially, it's saying that when you do get moderate match, which would not be the first thing you would do if you were doing familial searching, but you do moderate matches because you're looking to get a cold hit, when you get something that does hit, but it's not a full match, then in fact this is the procedure to be followed when you get a moderate match inadvertently.
So what's the...
So essentially, we're saying that first of all, we're dealing with single source profiles. Clearly, in the offender database, there's single source profiles, but the crime scene profiles, we're advocating that they be single source profiles. The complication that occurs if you don't restrict it that way is that often what labs will be searching with are profiles that are the obligate allele in a mixture, where it's known not to be the victim, let's say. And so when you do a search using just some obligate alleles, essentially that looks like a homozygote. That is, there's only one piece of genetic information, so you're going to get a lot of false hits that way, many more than if you had two pieces of information. And that's one of the, that's essentially what this expected match ratio is doing. It's looking at the value of the profile that was submitted. Now, in this particular draft policy, we're saying that you should be looking at single source profiles. You should be searching single source profiles and not profiles that have been derived incompletely from a mixture. So that was the first criteria there. And there's other administrative things. The submitting agency if this is going to be released, have agreed to pursue a further investigation if the name were released. So it's sort of preventing situations of doing this release of information where ultimately it turns out they're not going to pursue it. You know, there's many crimes where you get this hit and, well, maybe the person is already in jail under a more serious conviction, and they're not going to pursue this, or for whatever reason, chronologically, they've decided that, yeah, this case they're not going to pursue for, I don't know, a host of reasons, I guess, legally. So that would be another criteria that they would have to agree ahead of time before release that, yes, if it were released, they were going to be pursuing it. I guess that first point there is largely the administrative part, and then the second part there is about doing these two calculations, which the first one is a way of evaluating the quality of the profile that you're using to search with, and then the second calculation evaluates the likelihood that this moderate match is coming about by virtue of the fact that it's likely to come from two people who are closely related. And we set the standard for those, which is following exactly the standard that the FBI Swigdam committee recommended.
So in here I don't see any...
No, you're right, Jack. There's no YSTRs mentioned here.
Wait a minute. It does.
It does?
In
Okay.
sort of implicit way. Look at the last sentence on the first page. If necessary, the data bank also may contact subcommittee agency to determine if
Additional
information
DNA
for additional DNA loci
You're right.
is available, or if data from additional loci can be acquired.
Right. And so that includes Ys. We haven't
Y and
explicitly said...
mitochondria.
Oh, yeah, that's
Specifically,
true.
it was not.
Yeah, yeah.
No. And we discussed that in our task group conference.
Yes,
call.
we did. We did. Yeah, and I didn't remember. I had forgotten, and I hadn't read it recently. I thought we specifically said
Because-
Ys there, but
Because
it's
the
broader than Ys.
two documents that are publicly out about this, one from California and one is the interim policy of FBI, both addresses additional loci more categorically. And I raised that point during our conference call, and I was pointed out that since we do not have the Swigdam document in hand, and since we cannot officially use the California document. Let us be less explicit and state it this way. So in that sense, it is in conformity with both what is apparently being practiced in California and what Sweden document would intend to do.
I mean, the difference is that in California, they explicitly say
Explicitly
why.
said that you have to be filtered through
And they're
the
not going to release it unless you
Right.
know that you can compare whys.
Right.
We're not saying that. Specifically, but
Right.
we're strongly advising that additional loci be used whenever possible.
And why this slight ambiguity? Is this because the California policy is specifically for familial searching, and this is a partial match policy? So was that the concept, Dr. Disman?
Maximum flexibility, basically. We thought the worst situation, we could envision that you wouldn't really need YSPRs. And there's a possibility that there may be some other new technologies coming down the road that we may be able to use in place of this against YSPRs. There might be instances, for example, like you might want to look at mitochondrial DNA. So we just wanted to leave it general and not specify. The final decision will be based on the statistical results. So we would have a solid foundation going forward. But the choice of technologies would be left up to the labs.
Another, Dr. Prince?
Mackie Prince, New York City OCME. It is also not always the case that additional sample is available for testing.
Right.
During testing, the evidence sample might have been consumed.
But maybe adding some language saying that if additional testing would reduce the potential for false positives, it should be pursued. Not, just being a little bit more specific and saying that, if that is potentially available, it will be done, versus just leaving it totally optional. Because then money could come into it. People could choose not to do it for financial reasons when scientifically it should be done.
But you'd still presume that you had met the statistical criteria for starting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because what you want to try to avoid is saying, well, we haven't quite reached that threshold, so let's do Ys to kind of boost it over that threshold. I mean, that.
Right. No, I agree with that. I was just thinking of more of, once you've got it, just as an extra test to make sure that you can eliminate some false positives. If you have the material and the means for another test, that it should be, recommended.
Is there an issue then, I guess it's not part of our deliberations, but becomes an issue, is it possible then to do additional testing on database samples without getting permission to do that in some fashion? I mean, there's that point. Let's say if you decided that we want to do the Y, and you could do the Y on the crime scene sample.
Mm-hmm.
That's only going to be useful if you can also get the Y on the database sample.
Right.
Is it then presently possible to do that, to do additional testing on the offender samples?
The way I read the law, I think as long as you restrict it to SDR testing right now, the way the language of the law reads, I'd want to double check that, but I do believe right now it's very specific for SDR.
So that presently you could not, but Y chromosome is STR.
Yeah.
So you say it's okay, right?
But mito you couldn't do.
But mito you couldn't.
Definitely won't have a legal opinion, but that's
Right.
a fine question.
Does the law prevent doing mito on the offender sample?
I don't think it's provided for, but again, I want to check.
Yeah, I don't think it's provided for either.
Because I know that in California, some prosecutors are saying that you can do additional typing on offenders database as long as it relates to investigation of a crime. So on that argument, they are proceeding to do mito also on the offenders sample.
But not on offenders that may not be involved. That is, you couldn't say and change the policy on typing everybody in the database.
That has not, I do not know whether any state is doing that on a routine basis. But at some point, Codis was discussing whether they should add my to and Y on a regular basis on the offenders database. I do not know of any LD slab or SD slab doing that on a routine basis or not.
Well,
But the new generation code is software would probably require that. So it is coming for the offenders database to do the full battery of the 3 platforms.
Because it seemed in what we received last night that in Virginia, their advisory committee looked into the issue of how much it would cost, for example.
Yeah, it's a cost
how much per
cost.
sample it would cost to do Ys. And it looked like they were projecting to do it on the entire offender database in the state of Virginia.
So, and just coming back to your point then, in paragraph 2 here of this partial match policy, it says, the last sentence, if necessary, the data bank also may contact. Do you want stronger word, if necessary and appropriate, or some other wording in there? Is that your, or do you think if necessary, is that strong enough? If necessary, or are you suggesting perhaps what is necessary mean?
Maybe it is suggested that if it is possible, that further testing could be done to reduce the number of false positives, it should be done. Make it encouraging it as opposed to,
Well, but if necessary and appropriate to reduce an expected high number of false positives, something like that. I mean,
or just to reduce false positives. I wouldn't necessarily say a high number of.
Mm-hmm. You could always argue that in every single instance there'll be almost every instance there'll be several potential false positives.
Right. But
So
it does seem like a good idea to do the further testing
Yeah,
to
it does.
advance the investigation.
It does.
And by having it in here, it might give the policymakers some rationale for providing the funds to do that.
Well, that's the issue. What you're recommending is something that is optimal, that is absolutely optimal. If you had adequate resources and personnel, but before we recommend that optimal be routine, let's consider the consequences.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's in the best interests of the laboratories that are going to have to live with this.
And in many instances there is insufficient sample as well as Dr.
Yeah.
Prince said.
Well,
So that's
right,
an
in that
issue.
case, it wouldn't be
Yeah.
an issue. But if we're supposed to just speak to the science in terms of our recommendations, scientifically, it's the better approach. Whether or not it's affordable, I'm not sure that that's our place to decide.
Want to tell it as it is, say it is optimal but not mandatory that such and so be done.
Right, I'm not suggesting that we say it's mandatory. I'm just saying we encourage it.
But I still think this document ought to reflect that you can do an adequate job, an acceptable job, without doing this additional testing. And I think we ought to say explicitly that this is an optimal way to do it, but it isn't required.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that it be required.
Barry or Mickey, would you have a sense of how many of these moderate matches might turn up in a year or per month? Is it likely to be dozens or hundreds?
Very few.
Very few. So more like in the order of maybe one per month or one a week
A few.
would be that sort of range of things. So we're not, because you see that this is the confusing thing too. If you're doing familial searching, you're talking about thousands of these turning up that have to be pursued. These that occur kind of inadvertently are likely to be of a smallish number, you're suggesting. And so I'm guessing that, I mean, maybe we don't want to say it right now, but at least with the number that we foresee coming up now, doing this additional testing is not going to be really an economic significant have an economic significant impact. I don't think.
But it's good not to set the policy.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. Yeah, right.
Push
so we
that.
don't bind us to get in the
It's
corner
better
where we
to-
then all of a sudden have to budget another $1 million or something. Yeah.
Yes.
The only thing we know for sure is that the number will increase as time goes by, not decrease.
And
Right.
I would tend to agree with that too.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And note that you are not really requesting for Y or mito testing unless in those even in the moderate stringency match cases, the EKR or EMR value
It's way up.
exceeds that.
Yeah.
So those data is clearly available on the bench.
Right. Without any additional testing. Sure.
Without any additional testing.
Yeah, it's just doing a
So
calculation.
not only moderate stringency cases, of those who exceed the EMR or EKR value of the threshold as described in the technical document. So you're looking, my presumption is in our generation you do not have to really look at a whole lot of samples to be typed for additional loci.
When you say our generation, you mean the next 20 years or something?
Yeah.
Something like that. But
Unless the crime running into families increased tremendously.
On a related issue then, and I had a question on this anyway, the EKR, EMR, why it's basically a likelihood ratio calculation. Why is the LR there's a moderate it's a moderate LR when you fire the rule. In other words, if it's a greater than 1, right? And so why is it such a moderate and low, relatively low likelihood ratio as opposed to say 110, 100? Why is it at 1.0?
Well,
It's greater than 1.0.
in fact, Jack, what happens here is that first of all, maybe just I can address these two terms here without getting into equations and stuff. But this EMR is done strictly on the profile that you use for searching. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a way of evaluating that profile. If there are a lot of the loci where you have only one piece of information, okay, that's going to devalue that. So you're saying ahead of time, we can just look at the profile that was used for searching and say, without even comparing it to anything else, what we would expect its value would be in terms of, is this a good profile to find relatives with? See? And so then we're saying, well, it should at least be 1 or so, which is a pretty low level, I agree, but we do it on all 4 databases. And one of them at least has to be, it's saying that you have, well, that means it has a 50% chance of being useful. And we thought that was a reasonable level to sort of set for one of the populations. And on the other 3, it has to at least be 1 in 10 likely to form something, to give us some useful information. So I agree that that's pretty low. But we felt that then the second one, the kinship ratio, where you're calculating something where you have 2 profiles, where you have done an evaluation of the search profile to say, well, yeah, this is because that was the problem that Tom Callahan was suggesting to us, that a lot of the search profiles were highly homozygous. Mm-hmm. And you could tell from the start that this is not a good way to start this thing. It's going to give a lot of false positives because you don't have enough information there. But then when you did get, and so you passed that screen, and that screen's pretty low actually, because we didn't want to avoid, we wanted to get as many good ones as we could. So we set that pretty low. And then we used the same criteria for when you actually did compare the search profile against this partial match profile. To then say, well, how does that fit in the grand scheme of things, of all the different partial matches that you get? And again, set it relatively low. So there's like, we thought that with a likelihood ratio of 1, it's like you're saying, well, yeah, it has a 50-50 chance here. It's low, I agree, but that second one takes into account the size of the database that you search too. Because as that database gets bigger, it has an effect in lowering and making it more stringent. So it takes into account the size of the database that you're searching.
But the way it's written here gives you the ability to do either EMR or the EKR. It doesn't say you have to do both.
Both. Yeah, well, I mean, I think in practice, what you're going to be doing is EKR there, because you have the two profiles.
Yes.
But we were addressing, I think, and maybe that wouldn't be necessary here. I mean, if you have the software to do it, it's one additional calculation. It's not. It may not be important. I'd say the kinship ratio would be the more significant one to do. But in terms of the FBI policy, they wanted us to be able to evaluate, that profile that was used to search with, because there were people who were searching and they weren't necessarily single source profiles. They were coming from mixtures. And sometimes when you deconvolute from a mixture, maybe you can't always be 100% sure that you have everything from that one individual. There might be some composite information there that would be misleading. I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, what you said is correct. I would make only one additional comment. EMR calculation also takes into account the database size.
The EMR, yes, you're right. They both do. Yeah. You're right.
So have any simulation studies been done? In other words, for example, say New York adopted this policy then where you need an LR, EMR, EKR greater than 1. How many, if they did simulation experiments within the state, how many? Because you don't want the state having too many false positives. So it would seem appropriate to at least before this would be implemented to check what the LR, what that EKR would be, so you wouldn't have too many false positives.
Actually, both Ranajit and Stephen Myers did simulations.
We did,
yes.
When we were subcommittee members of the SWIG dam, at least two independent groups did simulation before we recommended EMR and EKR.
And you think that 1.0 is sufficient to make the number of false positives a reasonable number?
Right.
With a database of the size of California, which is quite large.
They have roughly over 1 million, I think, in California presently. But this is also addressing at the national level. I think
actually it would be. My simulations ran with 6 million, which is the ND size. Now, if I may comment about the draft document.
Yes.
In view of the discussions that we had, what Anne suggested and Dr. Hirsch commented on, maybe the last sentence can be modified as, it is suggested that should relevant samples be available to reduce the chance of false positive, further additional DNA loci maybe can be occurred.
Yeah, that was the kind of wording I had in mind.
And that takes care of, it's not it's optimal but not mandatory kind of thing. Should relevant sample and necessary resources be available to reduce the chance of false positive further.
My question is this necessary? Why poke a sleeping dog? I mean, everybody will know this, and what's the necessity of, if it can be misunderstood, it will be misunderstood, and you can be sure that some people will say that you're doing an incomplete job if they don't like what you're doing. And what is really the necessity for saying that?
Now, from technical point of view, we can justify that on the following ground. As we have discussed already, these different kind of indices that are being suggested, the current threshold for them are being dictated by relevant simulation studies based on database of current size. Now, we are making our best guess about how big the database size would be in future, but there is no guarantee. How many relatives do we have to really investigate? There is no guarantee what that proportion would be. So YSTR mitochondria provides us a filter that reduces, he effectively increases the likelihood by, in my estimation, at least by 1,000-fold, given the size of the YSTR or mitochondrial databases. So these are additional guard against investigating false positives. We are very confident about what is being suggested as the current threshold for likelihood ratio or any of its close associates as the appropriate index. We have validated the threshold based on the current database size. But we want to look for the future where we are only basing on guesswork as to the size of the database or number of possible relatives of the incarcerated offenders.
I would remind you that it's easier to be a historian than a prophet. And I would rather see some language written into this mandating a review of this recommendation in 2 years' time after we get some experience, rather than try to anticipate what's going to come. And we all agree that we don't know. So why not mandate a periodic review based on experience? And then I'm just trying to stay away from making specific recommendations for workload requirements that may be unrealistic.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement with you. I'm not saying that.
It says if necessary, the data
Yeah.
bank may contact the submitting agencies to determine if information for additional loci is available. It says if necessary. The question is whether that wording, in the opinion of this subcommittee, is sufficient to that people have the knowledge and belief as to what that actually means, right? That without imposing undue restrictions on resources, etc. So I suppose that's the only question, whether that word, if necessary, to reduce the number of false positives, because that's basically what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah. No, I thought the original wording was flexible enough.
Yes.
But since the comments came that it is very vague,
Mr. Chairman, in the SWIGDAM recommendations, one of them was to keep essentially a watch on this and to continue to evaluate data as it came in. We didn't incorporate it into this recommendation here. It wouldn't hurt to have it in there. I guess I was just assuming that would be done routinely, but it's always nice to have that stated, that this be looked at. And maybe a 2-year period would be a good horizon to look at.
We have a question from, you state your name, please.
Steve Hogan from State Police. Just a suggestion as far as any modifications to this. The suggestion would be that you avoid the term false positive. I'm not sure that the term false positive fits. Every investigative lead that doesn't lead to the actual offender is not necessarily a false positive. It's got a pejorative connotation. It has potential with respect to Brady obligations, etc. So I mean, I threw out. I have nothing wrong with Ann's suggestion, to move in this direction. The language that I came up with was, when warranted by the circumstances, testing of additional loci should be considered and pursued. Sort of hands-off kind of a thing. But I would be troubled. It's not hard for me to think of ways in which the term false positive and the number of false positives and the protocol for false positives could be an invitation to mischief that we don't need.
I think we're in agreement.
I guess I'm so easily lapsing into kind of this epidemiological kind of pursuit of this.
Well, if we include, something about required follow-up and look at this again in 2 years, I can live with the wording at the bottom of the page there. But I think that's actually one lesson that has been learned, is that there should be a mechanism for following up and seeing how well things are actually working.
Yes.
So how about if we just add another specific point, 3? This policy will be subject to review every 2 years.
That's
Periodic review every 2 years.
And is it anticipated that the submitting agency will be, I don't know if you want to use the word required, to let us know what the outcome of the investigation was, and even the profile of the, individual who potentially is identified as a result of the investigation, so that you could kind of use that information and see how things are working? I don't know how that works, cooperation between states and investigative bodies.
I don't know either. It's more of a DCGS question.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Is it possible to say that one of the requirements of providing the convicted offender's name is that the investigative agency will provide feedback on the outcome of the investigation and even the profile of the person that's identified as the perpetrator, if it goes that far, and then you could have that data to sort of analyze how things went.
I mean, it may be most appropriate that every 2 years we gather up the information or the cases and report on the cases. I don't know if that's doable in terms of the volume, but that we produce a report so you can review what happened during, the 2-year period of how many times this was done and what the outcome was.
Mm-hmm.
Is that viable?
To get all that information back, I mean, it depends on...
For the
how
one or
many
two
there
cases
are.
that will happen with.
Well, yeah,
Should be
maybe.
easy.
Actually, the point 1D is somewhat relevant to what we are discussing here. Because one of the requirements is the submitting laboratory has confirmed that release of name will be followed by a report to the investigating agency.
Right.
The report will indicate that the match is indirect and will also indicate that the available data suggests that the source of the evidentiary DNA pattern is potentially relative to the convicted offender. Why don't we simply add a sentence, my periodic review of reports based on item 1D should be attempted to see the success of the policy.
Or should be provided to
Yeah.
the DNA subcommittee?
Should be a DNA subcommittee should be provided
Periodic
periodic
review of reports
periodic report
under-
based on
under
item 1D.
End of this policy
Right.
shall be conducted every 2 years.
Sounds reasonable.
That covers it.
Well, does that maybe open up the fact that I've heard about this issue of even with the straight cold hits, do we know how effective they are?
Actually, no.
Exactly. That's the
Actually,
point.
no. In fact, there is a paper in press where it is being argued if that data was available with today's size of the offenders database, we can say the offenders database is a no good database to derive any experience from about the statistical calculations. It is no longer a random sample for crime-related DNA profiles. There is a strong argument being made that all of the debate about database search is hopelessly wrong because with 5 million size of the offenders database, today it is no longer a random database for any crime-related samples. We cannot come with that clear-cut argument because we do not have the statistics in front of us as what were the RMP values for all of the cold hit cases that we have identified thus far. It's a simple statistic. The NDs or LDs or SDs, whoever found the cold hit, should have computed the RMP, kept it in the file. we would have data on 80,000 cold hit cases.
That we'd have as a way of comparing
Right.
what we're getting here.
Right.
Because this is assuming a random database, and in
Right.
fact, the 5 million people is not a
Not a
random database.
random date, no.
Just,
Is there any way to go back and get those RFPs for those?
well, I've given lectures in a couple of large states with large offenders database, and I told them that if necessary, I'll send my graduate student to work with them for a month, just to pull up those files and get the profiles, complete the RMP. I haven't heard anything as yet. Because 80,000 cold hits based on 5 million, even if I take the ND's data as such, it by itself says that we are looking for $1 million house in places where millionaires live.
Can I go back to this issue of the reports? Because I believe the report is a report from the lab to the investigating agency who originally sent the crime scene sample to say we have this potential match, but it may or may not be a relative. That report, I don't think, is really what you're looking for. I mean, that
Yeah, I was looking
identifies
for a
cases
report back from
where
the
it happened.
investigation.
But you want a report sometime at the end of it saying, this is what happened. It did lead to an arrest of someone who was a relative. And so this policy doesn't really provide for that, getting that information back in order to make it available to you. It may be that we have to require the investigating agency to report the outcome of the investigation to us and make that information available at some point, either yearly or every 2 years, while you're looking at this policy.
It would also be useful for us to see what the computed like LR likelihood
Right.
ratios are.
I would-
That's that these guys would be producing the New York State police.
We would have those, and potentially, and we could have the code staff follow up on the letters after a period of time and see what the resolution is. That would be possible, because we have a staff that basically does this sort of thing. We could take that on.
In other words, here's 20 cases, and here are the likelihood ratios, and here are the outcomes. Type of thing.
That seems like it would be most helpful to evaluate
Yeah, absolutely.
the utility
Absolutely.
and success of doing that.
Yep.
So,
But I was just making I guess it was a little bit not directly in relation to this, but I think it would be nice to see how that compares to real cold hits in terms of their effectiveness. You know, that we don't know how that we don't have the benchmark for how effective a real cold hit is, and yet we're being very careful about
Right.
these warm hits. I mean, if we can just get the warm hits, that's fine from my perspective. But I think from an overview, it'd be nice to know. I know it's not just New York State, but all over where this is being done, as to how effective these cold hits are in general too. Because I have heard claims that you can help an investigation by eliminating people, obviously, right? So it may turn out that with some of these moderate matches, it may not be that the moderate match directly led to the offender, but it helped the investigation in that it eliminated somebody that they otherwise would have spent a lot of time and money and effort tracking down. So investigations aided is not necessarily meaning that you've always found the culprit. But it would be nice to have that, I think. So you think maybe a third, or just include that as part of D, an additional requirement under 1D, that there be a record kept and I don't know, collated over periods of 2 years to see what the LRs are and whether they led to real related individuals, something like that. The wording, I'm just off the top of my head here, I haven't sort of worked out
No, I don't think it's necessary at this point to
No.
write the document right as such. We're still dissecting this document. I'm going to assume that there will be some wordsmithing, because we don't even have the definitions of EMR and EKR, and things of that nature. Is that I regard this so far as we're still dissecting this document. We haven't decided what to do with it yet, right? How to proceed from here. Because I have a question regarding just the first statement. Under the partial match policy, it says that the division, it says partial match obtained from state code search. The division may release the identity of a convicted offender in the event that a crime scene DNA pattern matches an offender's DNA pattern, and comparison reveals that the offender is clearly not the source of the crime scene profile. Now, that's the partial match, right? It's not actually, it doesn't match. Is that just the way it's written?
Yeah, I guess it should be partial matches.
Yeah.
Well,
Because it matches, then you're saying, well, it's not the source. You know, there must be a reason for it, because this.
want to use the word moderate match? I mean, that's what it in fact is, right? We're dealing with.
Again, it would wish for flexibility to provide for potentially other types of searches in the future. So we want to avoid the use of the word moderate and just match that was not a direct match.
But someone reading that, you think it matches, and then he's not the source. I'm just saying from we understand the nuances here of matches and partial matches. I'm just saying to any person reading that, it just sounds it matches this, and yet it's not the source. So I don't know if that's ambiguous to people who are not DNA analysts. That's all.
Well, it matches using the code's program, basically. It's under one of the stringency conditions, and the comparison reveals it's not the offender.
Because the Cody's document has a section on matches, and then it comes with high stringency, low stringency, moderate stringency. So here the match was used probably in that sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be all 26 alleles.
Now, I know myself what this means, but I'm just wondering if it's the best use of is there some wording in there that can make it, instead of using moderate, using some other event that a crime scene pattern matches using certain using criteria that established by the state, whatever it may be, some wordsmithing. So I thought that just it could be ambiguous to people reading that. That's all.
I guess you're saying that the colloquial understanding of using the word match means something either matches or doesn't match.
Right.
It's kind of a clear cut.
If you go to court and say it matches somebody,
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to court and say it
So it
matches
matches,
someone,
you mean
going to
everything
expect
is matching.
It comes from that person.
Right.
So now you're going to court and say it matched, but it didn't match. So I mean, you have to explain that. That's fine, and we have to do that. That's our job. But I'm just for a one-page document that's a policy type, not being read by DNA analysts, it may be ambiguous. That's all. That was just my statement. That some of the wording here may be open to maybe slightly better wordsmithing. That's
The
all.
wording that would typically be candidate match.
Candidate match. So that's.
I agree with you, Jack. I think the word match is loaded in the public domain. Would it be appropriate to say a crime scene DNA pattern is similar to an offender's DNA pattern, and comparison reveals the offender is clearly not the source?
Yeah.
You think?
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine.
It's similar. Yeah. 'Cause then it's
Similar.
That's then you avoid the
Match.
misunderstanding of match.
Dr. Disman, do you think that in your world it's similar to?
I could live yeah.
You use candidate match, right? Use the term
We do,
candidate match.
But I mean, basically, it is similar to
Yes,
it.
it's similar.
It's
That's exactly
very
what it is.
general, but I'm curious to see what people think.
Sometimes ambiguity is desirable.
I like it myself. I like it, but
Actually, there's another. We didn't use the word profile here. We use pattern. So when we actually talk about high stringency match, we said this DNA profile matches this DNA profile. And pattern and profile that doesn't necessarily have to be the same. But I would agree with, I mean, live with the word is similar to.
I guess to use a linguistic metaphor, we're not looking for the identical word, but we're looking for something that rhymes
Right.
with it, you know. There's some kind of quality to it that shows a common origin or something, or potentially shows a common origin. But yeah, I'm happy with that. Because I think we put candidate match in there, that's a little too technical.
Yeah.
So any further deconstruction of this draft match policy document itself? We've had an extended discussion on the contents. Dr. Prince?
Becky Prince, New York City OCME, and I was a member of the group writing the draft. I would like to follow up on what was discussed, about the follow-up, so periodical review and also measuring the impact of success. So this type of information is normally not available to the laboratories. There is a reporting mechanism where you report out that you have a investigation aimed at it. But there is also then a time period that passes, and sometimes the resolution is years later, and it's also another agency. So if it makes sense to collect the data also, especially as a DCGS or the CODA staff has a mechanism to reaching out to these investigative agencies, but I would not put it under 1D, where it is with the submitting laboratory. I would really, as has been discussed before, add a section 3 that then talks about by the periodic review and the collecting of the data for the impact in section 3 would be my suggestion.
So the question is then, what
Should we have that a third point, is what you're making? You
Right.
have a separate category entirely
The-
as a way of
saying
monitoring.
The DCGS, or New York State laboratories and DCGS are committed to following, collating data.
But just to confirm, we're only going to be collating data on those for which there's action. Because we release these to local laboratories, and basically they'll be making a request to follow up, and as they disposition these cases, and there may be some, for whatever reason, they don't think there's any work in following up. So we're only going to be following up those for which there has been a request from the local laboratory to have the name released, as opposed to every potential non-repeat.
Yes, only the names.
Okay, just so we're clear.
yes, that's the committee?
I think the scrutiny would be a good idea, because differently from a cold hit, where now the investigative agency investigates that one person, I think one of the public objections was that a whole family now all of a sudden is subjected to maybe unfair scrutiny. So to measure what type of impact or what the success is, to basically put families under this type of surveillance is a good idea, in my opinion. It is different from the cold hit success rate, which of course also is interesting. And I believe some people have data on this, but I know on the, for example, in Virginia on their website they have a lot of follow-up data. But I see there is a difference. So I think it's a good idea to put it in this document.
So,
All right, well,
yeah,
I have a proposal, whether it's E or 3, that would say the division, meaning DCJS, will report to the DNA subcommittee data received from investigating agencies regarding any names released pursuant to this policy. So if we release a name because of a request, then we'll attempt to follow up with them and get the data and report it to you.
I guess what I'm wondering is what kind of cooperation you're going to get, and I'm wondering if you can't upfront say, if you want the name of our convicted offender,
Sure.
you're going to agree to.
Yeah, we would have
Giving us
to.
the-
I think we would have to do that.
Okay.
But like Mickey said, they may not, that investigation still may take 2 years, 3 years, or
Right.
whatever. We may, that's the problem. But I think we should make that requirement that they respond to us and give us the information.
And
That work?
I agree with that. I think that should be a third point then, rather than just a sub-point of D or another additional point or E in there. I think that's important enough that we want to give it a separate hierarchical level there, that essentially communicating that we want to keep a watch on this to see how it's panning out, because it may lead to revisions of the policy, or that would be my suggestion. That would be a third point.
So I suppose the question then is do we have any further discussion then on the contents of this policy, or should we proceed with discussion on the actual document itself? Any further discussion on this partial match policy? We spoke at length now on it. Because I suppose the question is, what's the next stage with regard to this document? We've been making suggestions, adding wording, etc. There are some definitions that are not present at the moment. It would not be possible, or I don't know if it's possible, if we were asked if the lab was tasked with determining EMR and EKR, whether one could do that at this precise moment.
We've been offered some software.
Pardon?
We've been offered some software.
Okay. My question is it, and DCGS should have major input here also, in terms of this document, should we talk at this meeting about, okay, we've discussed in principles, the principles behind this, we're in agreement, talking as a potential way forward, agreement with the principles, and in terms of this policy, however, we would like the document to be modified to such an extent that we're all comfortable with, and then at the next meeting, formally discuss the document, have other people an opportunity of reviewing it, and then vote at the next meeting whether or not the subcommittee recommends this be sent to the Commission as a recommendation. Is that an appropriate?
Yeah, because it's got to go back. It's got to get massaged.
Or were people expecting something faster or quicker? I'm just because the next meeting is apparently, we'll talk about it later, but it's not that far off.
October.
Which, Jack, you say is not far off. That seems pretty far off to me. I don't know.
Oh, does it?
It does to me.
Maybe it is far off.
Because just also thinking that we'd be making this and would go up to the Commission itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes,
they're meeting in June, and I don't know how often they meet. I'm guessing twice a year, maybe, or something like that.
4 times, but
Four
not
times
again
a year. So if we had to wait till October, we'd maybe miss two of their meetings.
Right.
And I don't know. I think we want to have a policy in place before that. We'd like to get it as soon as possible.
So then there's Plan B, which is modify the document, pass it around electronically until everybody gives their assent.
That'd be my recommendation.
Yeah, and we did find a way to meet by conference call once to, if we can get a document that we think we all agree on, then...
Well, you can't take formal action via conference call. So,
Oh, I see.
We can?
no.
Well, how about if we were to approve this in principle at this meeting, and then it's just a sense of refining it, and then we get a further, subject to further approval electronically, or that wouldn't hold either? No.
No.
You have to meet formally.
Isn't that what just suggested? We just say that we approve in principle, however, in terms of the policy document itself, we need to review it.
We'd have to do it physically at the next
formally
meeting,
on it
which would be
at the next
October,
meeting.
yeah. Maybe that's all we
We
can do.
can't-
Are there other concerns that we could make, if we go through the document, that we could make now that, or is there additional review that needs to be done? I'm not really sure.
I don't think additional review needs to be done.
That's my point. I was trying to get to the stage where we say we've dissected this document now, and we have made several suggestions. We now need to see a kind of a document that incorporates all these suggestions, right?
We have about another 45 minutes. Maybe I could just quickly make these changes and...
I think so.
But,
give it
but
back.
I'm still concerned with it. It's EMR and EKR.
Oh, to be
it's not
defined
clear
and
what
explicitly.
is EKR and EMR. It's, no one can go to the internet just now, I don't believe, anyway,
No.
and find out what EMR or EKR is. Don't we have to define them in some ways? No. It's a
there a
nebulous
definition?
concept.
I mean, what they asked for was a description of the criteria, and we can't provide that right now, right, in terms of the sweep dam document, because it's
There's no
not
algorithm.
really-
We cannot provide an algorithm to the New York State at this precise moment, right? Is that a true statement? We cannot provide that algorithm. Now, we know what some of us know what the algorithms are, but because of the nature of where they came from and confidentiality, we can't actually... We can describe them in concept, but they're likely to actually describe what they actually are. And talk about the probability, but the actual formulation itself, the recommended formulation, is not yet available, right? So
Was that discussed in other public forums, George? At the public? I mean, I thought my conversation with the FBI was that the actual document couldn't be released, and with Ted Staples.
But the details of it.
discussion, it was discussed publicly before.
It was discussed publicly before. We tried to, when the committee was meeting, before we brought it forward to SWIGDAM, we did not publicly, discuss it. We discussed it within the committee, but because we wanted to, we didn't want partial ideas to get sort of miscommunicated and so forth. We didn't have a lot of communication outside our committee deliberately, because there was some pressure being brought on the committee from different sides and so forth, that we didn't want to have to confront individuals, say, we're doing this, we're proposing this. We waited till it went to SWIGDAM for that public open process to happen. But I know that within certain states there was some discussion of it publicly. Not publicly, I don't know exactly what that means, but it would be within a group of people that were not sworn to secrecy or anything like that. And we were not actually, and that's what surprised me, because we in fact, when we signed non-disclosure agreements, it was not about the document itself. It was just, in fact, when we went and had it legally analyzed, what we had signed was, in fact, the profiles we were given as exemplars.
Right.
That they were, from actual casework, and so therefore they could not, and we had this private information, and it was really about that. So that's why I was quite surprised. I was expecting that when I asked Ted, he said, oh, sure, fine, just distribute it. And he said, no. And they said, well, what about just in the subcommission itself? No, sort of thing. In fact, his response, I was surprised at his response within the subcommission. He said, well, in fact, his answer was, well, just look what I said previously. It was kind of a little bit annoying to me when he didn't even consider that, well, within the subcommittee here, subcommittee, right? That we couldn't discuss it because, I think many of us have seen this.
But just to be clear, it's going to be published, right? It was more that you didn't want to, that
Yes.
they didn't want you to preempt what is going to be published. It's not that this is secret. It's just that they asked you to wait until it's published.
Yeah, so it's not secret in that sense, and I don't have any problem, actually sending it to you. Maybe you've already seen it, but and the details of it, and the there's no secret equations in there like atomic bomb secrets or something like that. They're open. They're not patentable.
Right, it's not proprietary.
Anything like that.
So can you talk about the expected match ratio and the kinship ratio, or?
Yes, I could.
Right, because
I could.
my conversation with the FBI seemed to say that you can
I
talk
could do
about
that.
it, you just couldn't give out the actual document.
Right. Yeah.
So we can
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was about to suggest the same, because since you now have found the same thing that as I found, I am fighting with this roadblock for more than 8 months, because there are several other committees in which I'm a member of, and this issue comes up, and I wanted them to have the SWIGDAM document, but I was told not to disseminate it. But they gave me permission to discuss it. So you also confirm that the document should not be disseminated, but they have no issue with the public discussion of the same. So I think George and I can present to the subcommittee what EKR and EMR stands for and how they are calculated. Yeah. So as far as
and that was my point. My point is that if EMR and EKR are not terms of art yet in this business. They're brand new, so we'd have to define what EMR and EKR is. Don't you think so? Or what do my fellow members of the subcommittee think?
But it's going to be defined soon.
Yes.
Officially, right? So you could also say and cite what's coming that defines it.
But it's just, Mark, there was no time frame ever given to me as to when it is going to be published.
Right.
And just from my past experience with other documents, we're often talking 18 months, 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, with the Y recommendations, Jack, that you remember that committee, they just, it was 2 years ago when we approved those, and they just appeared in January, wasn't it? Something like that. So, Ted Staples cannot give us any time frame as to when that's going to be. It's not in the, June issue. So it could be a year from now, and we want to have something that would be usable right now. But we can discuss it. We can, we could write down what they are. I mean.
I don't think that's the key. Is Jack's right? They ought to be defined terms.
Actually, as you discussed during our task group meeting, there is a public domain index out in literature called ratiometer from California, which is, in my calculation, a constant apart from that of EKR. So we can say EKR defined as such and such in the upcoming SWIG-DAM document is similar to the ratio measure as described in the public domain citation, right? If that helps the rest of our committee members, subcommittee members, that might be the way to go.
My only concern is the time factor. Can this be done today or not? That's the question. I think that's the only question, because there was a suggestion that we could take a small adjournment and the document could be put together. Could that be done? Could it be done? That's the question. Should it be done?
So the key there is, you guys would have to grind this stuff with the EKR.
Yeah.
The rest of it can be done.
Well, let me just propose a possibility here that if it comes down to essentially being able to define these two calculations, the EMR and EKR, they could be part of, let's say, a one-page appendix or something like this. It's kind of like almost like a glossary, a statistical glossary or something, if you want to view it that way, that I think Ranajit and I could prepare. And I'm pretty sure it's going to look daunting enough to most people on the committee that you're going to say, well, if they think it's okay, I'm going to think it's okay too. So I think if it's just a question of, if it just comes down to defining those two terms, which it seems to me is what it is, right? We want to have, before okaying the document, we want to know what it is we're approving.
Right. That
we could just say, well, we'll approve this subject to the fact that there is an explicit, clear definition of what these two terms are, because they haven't been formally published yet, and they're still, I guess, in legal terms, maybe hearsay in that sense. They've been looked at by a number of people, approved by a number of people. We have no question of their value. Ranajit, do you have any thought that there might be some algebraic error in those? I doubt it. I think it's been vetted very carefully. So if it really comes down to just a definition there, I think we could maybe today approve a document, and then there would be an additional, you might call it appendix even, but it would be just a definition of what those two terms are, in terms of a little bit of algebra.
Are we permitted by conference call to make editorial changes in documents that the committee has previously approved?
Well, no, because then you'd have to vote to send it to the commission, because the commission has asked for your recommendation, so you couldn't actually vote.
No, but what I'm saying, if we approve this document, and then subsequently make minor editorial changes to it, can't we do that by conference call?
Well,
I mean,
I would say no, because it wouldn't be the same document
Right.
that you'd be sending on.
The only way that goes out of here today is it's got to be done.
I mean, you could
I
make
just-
that change, that you're approving it subject to the inclusion of a footnote listing the expected match ratio and expected kinship ratio. I don't know how long they are. Would they fit in a footnote or?
Yeah, well, it's
A
going to be
long
a paragraph.
footnote.
It's going to be a paragraph.
Okay.
1 page.
So, subject to the inclusion of that
I mean,
attachment.
in fact, manager, we can just cut and paste out from the appendix, because they're actually in the appendix of the recommendations to the SWIGDAM recommendations. And it's interesting that the SWIGDAM recommendations take up a total, the recommendations themselves, I think, are about 4 pages.
4 pages.
And then
Appendix
the
is 12
statistical
pages.
appendix is 18 pages. So it just shows you the tail and the dog here a little bit. But I think in terms of, in that statistical appendix to the SWIGDAM document, much of that is not about just definitions of what these are.
Yeah.
I mean, in definitions of what these are, I would say...
1 page.
One page. And in fact, if we wanted to adjourn for, 15 minutes or something like that, I could cut and paste something together on my computer and have it available here, and you can see what it would look like.
If you want to get it done, let's do it.
Do you want to?
Sure.
We can do that?
That's what we want to do.
So can we adjourn for 15 minutes then?
We can.
Well, welcome again. I'd like to reconvene the DNA subcommittee meeting, and we now have a draft, an updated draft of the partial match policy, and Gina will go through with us what has been changed.
Okay. Under partial match obtained from state CODIS search, in the second line of that first paragraph, the word matches has been changed to is similar to. The next change, under number 1C, we added a sentence that says, such entities also agree to provide follow-up information to the division regarding the outcome of the case. Okay, and number 2, after the expected match ratio and the expected kinship ratio, there's a new parens that says, as those terms are defined in attachment A. And then number 3 is completely new. This policy will be subject to review every 2 years. The division will report to the DNA subcommittee any information received from investigating agencies regarding names released pursuant to this policy. And then there is an attachment A, which is a 2-page document.
Yes, and I could just speak to that 2-page
Yes.
document. Basically, Ranajit and I went through the appendix of the SWIGDAM document, and this is not verbatim, but it's very close to it. We made some very minor changes to it was mostly formatting in the difference between the original appendix and the SWIGDAM document and what we have written here. But the substance of it is, I'd say, 99% of what was in that appendix to the SWIGDAM document. So it does define it. It doesn't use algebraic equations as such, but at least anybody who had this would know how the calculations were done. And it has a brief description of each. We added a little bit of bolding here and there and changed some of the wording to make it consistent to this.
I move approval of the partial match policy document and its attachment.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion?
Just for completeness, on the modification for item 2, as those terms are defined in attachment A, as the purposes of, as the definition and purposes of those terms described in appendix A.
Yes, that's correct. It's not merely just definitions. We actually do describe the purpose of them. Yep.
As these terms are defined and used,
purposes and definitions of which are described in Appendix A.
Okay. So,
So say again,
As
Gina
those
wants to
mark-
take us down.
yeah.
What-
Let's mark it.
So could we just say as those terms are used in attachment A? Because then it would encompass both the definition and purpose,
Or described.
as described, yeah?
As described in Appendix A.
As those terms are described,
Yeah,
okay.
instead of defined,
Yeah.
described.
Okay.
Okay, any, so,
So that's a friendly amendment.
yes,
Do you agree to this friendly amendment?
it was a friendly amendment.
I accept the amendment.
So
I'll second that.
Second, any further discussion? So I suppose what we're here to do now is to approve this partial match policy document and send it to the Commission as a binding recommendation. Is the terminology?
As a recommendation.
Yeah.
They asked you for a
Correct.
recommendation, they didn't ask you for a
Yes.
finding, so.
Okay. So then, the motion is to accept this partial match policy with that friendly amendment that Dr. Chakraborty mentioned, and this is a recommendation to be sent to the Commission for their further discussion. All those in favour? Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's, the last item on the agenda then is the next meeting date and location. And we have it down for the October the 9th, 2009. And is that reasonably okay for everyone at this moment? Yeah. Okay.
Kathy and Louie called around.
Yeah. Okay, with that then, I should like to thank everyone.
Jack, I just wanted to raise a point about the letter that you received. Do you think it's adequate that we just stop with your response to the
Yeah.
letter that you received? Or do you think that we need to address it, that you'd like a wider answer?
Well, I think we described earlier that we discussed this earlier, and we are referring here to a partial match policy, and that pertains to a familial searching policy. And so, since that's not what we're doing yet
Right.
in New York State, and it remains to be seen whether it will be done,
Right.
then maybe perhaps at that time, if there is a request to look at a familial searching policy, then perhaps we can take that into account.
Yeah.
But I just think that your response last night, or early this morning, was that, in fact, we would look at this, we don't have time to consider it for this meeting and so forth. Do we need to maybe answer them, or you answer them and say that, this is, when you've had time now to read it further, that in fact what they're advocating and telling us about is not really pertinent to what we were doing?
I don't think it's
You don't think so?
necessary.
Just leave it the way it is?
That's
Okay.
my own view.
Yeah,
I have no
you
problem.
said you got it. That's,
But
I mean,
it's not relevant to
not
a particular
relevant.
what we're doing at this precise moment. Okay, with that then, I should like to thank everyone for attending, members of the subcommittee and guests and the Commissioner, and I should like to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Taking the trip. I know how very busy you all are, but you're vitally important to what we do, and I feel so fortunate in New York that we have you and have your expertise as we're dealing with these difficult issues. So, again, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.